Good evening and welcome to the new BUGAJSKI Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important questions with a major security analyst, with our guest on the BUGAJSKI hot seat, Ian Brzezinski, one of the key foreign and security policy analysts in Washington. But first, my political commentary on an important international topic is entitled Trump's Xenophobic America. The surge in support for populist Donald Trump has sent nervous shivers through America's political establishment, as well as Washington's international allies. Despite a string of controversial statements, New York billionaire Trump continues to lead the Republican presidential field with a committed core of supporters. Every country has a significant minority who fall for bigotry and simple solutions. Charismatic individuals can sway gullible citizens with promises to root out enemies and ensure security. From the outset of his election campaign, Trump has been deliberately controversial in order to gain media attention. In his announcement speech as a Republican candidate, he claimed that people entering the US from Mexico included, quote, rapists, criminals, and drug dealers, unquote. At a time when Republicans are trying to make inroads among the growing Hispanic community, Trump's comments were controversial and counterproductive. Trump is feeding on the fear that the government cannot keep its citizens safe after the terrorist attacks in California at the end of last year. To demonstrate his determination to defend Americans, he proposed closing mosques and registering all of America's Muslims. He also demanded the closure of the US border to all Muslims, an outrageous idea that appeared to cross a moral line and the principles on which the United States was built. Trump's conservative supporters, about 30% of the Republican base, are very vocal and highly mobilized. They believe that success in business can translate into running the country. They fail to understand that the business model is not comparable to dealing with complex domestic and international issues. The presidential nomination process begins in February in Iowa, followed by a number of other states. If his disputes with Republican leaders continue, Trump may abandon the party and stand as an independent or even form his own third party. This, of course, can seriously damage Republican chances in the upcoming elections, as Trump could capture the party's most conservative voters. A Democrat victory would then seem almost inevitable. In the long term, it would be more beneficial for the Republicans to expel Trump from the party on the grounds of hate speech and fomenting religious conflict. Such a stand would sacrifice the forthcoming elections, but the party could then gain significant middle ground for standing up for national principles. If Trump is nominated as the Republican candidate, the party will in any case lose the presidential elections, as the majority of Americans will not fall for bombastic populism. It is much better to lose with dignity than to be tarred with the xenophobic brush. It is time for the BUGAJSKI hot seat, and our special guest today from Washington, D.C. is Ian Brzezinski, one of the key security and foreign policy analysts here in Washington. Welcome to the show, Ian.
Thank you, Janusz. I'm sweating already in the hot seat.
Thanks for joining me. We'll try and get the air conditioner up in a minute, but I wanted to cover a sort of broader picture questions for our audience in Kosovo, just to place Kosovo in a broader international structure. And as I said at the outset, you specialize in security questions, particularly those pertaining obviously to Europe, to the United States, and to the transatlantic world. Let's the first question, let me ask you this. At the start of the new year, 2016, what would you say are the main threats that Europe and America face in terms of their security?
I think that there are four fronts facing the transatlantic community, the NATO community. Mm-hmm. You have a front to the east that's driven by Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine, its invasion of Ukraine, and its increasingly provocative actions across Europe. The air incursions, the submarine incursions, the snap exercises, all which are threatening maneuvers and challenge the credibility of the alliance's security apparatus. Similarly, you also have another Russian-driven front to the north. This is an emergent front in the Arctic. Russia's militarizing the Arctic, and the alliance is going to have to respond to that at some point. And you have a third front to the south, stretching from Turkey's borders all the way west to the western portions of the Mediterranean, a region beset by failed states, terrorist organizations, extremist ideologies, struggling societies. And you have a fourth front, the global front. In an age of globalization, NATO cannot be a solely regionally focused alliance. It has to address the increasing challenges that are emanating from beyond the North Atlantic area.
I want to come back in a little while on the question of Russia, particularly Russia's activities in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. But given what you've said, let me ask you this. For the Balkans, for people living in Southeast Europe, what are the security challenges? I mean, in addition to, as I said, Russia, which I'll come to in a moment, is it terrorism? Is it economic decline? Is it ungovernability? In other words, soft security threats which could also lead to hard security threats. Do you see such a picture in the region?
Well, the Balkans has been a post-Cold War success story. We've seen integration into the EU, into NATO. We've seen societies there prospering more, but it's also a region that's still beset by its own internal dilemmas, governance issues, some ethnic tensions and such. Externally, I would say two of those fronts I mentioned are relevant to the Balkans. Of course, there's the Russia dimension. Russia continues to probe and seek division within the Balkans, stirring up and contributing to some of the lingering animosities between different elements of the Balkan societies. And then the southern front, of course, is directly affecting the Balkans today. The migration issue is an urgent challenge. It brings not only socioeconomic stresses, but also is bringing through that region terrorist threats. And, you know, further integration into NATO, further integration to the EU, strengthening societal resilience, economic prosperity are all key elements of a strategy to help this region become more resilient to these challenges.
But would you say that in addition to the Russian threat, that there are internal threats that somehow we should be concerned about in these societies? In other words, not just ungovernability and slowness in merging with NATO and the EU, but maybe some internal conflictive elements, new ideologies that we have to be aware of.
Well, you know, as one who follows it more from an external point of view from the Balkans, I can't argue against that. What I do see is that internal weaknesses are allowing extremist ideologies to kind of permeate into these societies. And that's a challenge. And it's manifested most directly by, you know, the potential for terrorist actions. Bulgaria has experienced it. Romania has experienced it. We haven't had direct terrorism I'm aware of, you know, Islamic extremist terrorism in the southern Balkans quite yet, but it's very, very possible because these are vulnerable open societies.
Would you say that international terrorism is a major security threat? One hears often that you know, the Balkans are a breeding ground for terrorism, the transit routes for international terrorists, for training, for recruits, for ISIS and so forth. How dangerous are the Balkans in terms of that terrorist connection, would you say?
I look at the Balkans right now primarily as a transit route rather than a breeding ground for terrorism. And the transit route is enough of a challenge in itself. If things were to turn south, so to speak, in the Balkans in terms of their economies, in terms of their internal stability, in terms of tensions, then of course it could possibly emerge as a breeding ground. But I don't think we're quite at that point. The primary challenge right now is helping these societies manage the burdens and threats that come with the migrant flows through their territories.
Because, as I said, one often hears that disproportionately Muslim populations in the Balkans produce more recruits for organizations such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda in the past. Is this true, or would you say this is a bit of exaggeration?
There isn't a European country that isn't subject to the threat of indigenous terrorism fomented externally by Islamic extremists. And while it's true that a society that has a significant Muslim population, for example, some in the Balkans, are more vulnerable to that, I'm not sure it's that much different than from what we're seeing in France and in Belgium and elsewhere in Europe.
In other words, it's not the fact that one is either Muslim or nominally Muslim. It's a question of what kind of what kind of an ideology that one acts upon. In other words, is it radical? Is it non-radical? And often secularism is key in many Muslim societies in Southeast Europe.
I think the key is to look. One has to be aware of religious affinities, but the key is how, to what degree are certain segments of society fully integrated and prospering within a broader society. And when a particular community isn't, it's always a little bit more vulnerable to being manipulated by those who wish to do harm to others.
This is such a good opportunity to ask you. I'm not sure how much you follow developments in Syria and Iraq, particularly on the IS front, and the role of the United States, of NATO, and now, of course, Russia on the side of Assad. What impact will this conflict have on the wider Europe? I mean, some in Europe think it's outside, it's none of our business. Okay, it's a very brutal organization, but why should we get involved?
Well, it's clear their business today. I mean, look, this is a conflict that's been going on for years. It's displaced hundreds of millions of people internally and externally, and though many of those are flowing through Europe today, and we had horrible manifestations of the threat that's posed just this year alone in France, the horrible attacks there, in Turkey, the horrible attacks there. Hundreds of people in NATO countries have been killed by terrorists who've been leveraging these migrant flows. So the crisis in Syria, the crisis in Iraq is very relevant to all the nations of NATO.
Which brings me, of course, to NATO's preparedness for some of the security threats that you mentioned. Let's start with the terrorist threat. What is it that NATO needs to do in order to more effectively combat the growth and threat of international terrorism?
You know, I think there's a tendency to overstate NATO's role in combating terrorism. Terrorism is often also a law enforcement issue. It's a matter of controlling borders. It's a matter of tracking people inside one's countries. It's preventing terrorists from entering and operating in countries. Those really aren't NATO domains. NATO's domain really is, using force as an element of a broader strategy, traditionally to defend against state aggression. Of course, it can play a role in combating terrorism, but I'm not sure that responsibility is primarily a NATO responsibility. It's primarily a state responsibility, a member state responsibility.
Although one could argue we're dealing with two kinds of terrorism that sometimes are rolled into one. I mean, IS uses let's say, the terrorist network to stage attacks on Western capitals, but it also has a military structure in Iraq and Syria, which is pretty conventional from what I understand. Presumably NATO can be more effective in combating that military structure, which is one of the roles of NATO.
Yeah. You know, when you look at NATO, you have to remember that it is an organization that facilitates cooperation among member states. And it's member states, not NATO, but member states that come up with a comprehensive strategy to deal with the threat. That was the case during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. You didn't have a strategy against the Soviet Union driven by NATO. You had it driven by collective or consensus cooperation among NATO member states. And NATO served as sort of the executive arm responsible for the military dimension of that comprehensive strategy. That's the same approach in NATO, or same role NATO will be playing in the battle against terrorism.
Coming to one other question, actually, before we turn to Russia, I wanted to go in a little bit more detail on Russia. The recent confrontation between Russia and Turkey over, let's say, Russian flights over Turkish airspace, over Russian bombing of Turkomen people in Syria who are closely affiliated with Turkish people. How do you see this evolving? Is Turkey now, would you say, becoming more supportive of NATO action as a result of this conflict with Russia? How do you see this evolving?
I think the incident between Turkey and Russia has caused Turkey to reappreciate the value of the alliance and reappreciate the potentials of its relationship with the European Union. You've already seen Turkey open up its territory to NATO operations. Following that, it was an important reminder how central NATO is to Turkey's security. So there's been a shift sort of in Turkish foreign policy back to its old friends.
Right, because Turkey, from what I've seen of opinion polls, has been, population at least, has been very anti-American for many years. Presumably this is also changing Turkish views of Russia and America.
I think Turkish views of Russia have become a lot more realistic. I think Turkish appreciation of its relationship with Washington and with Brussels has dramatically changed following the Turkish shoot-down of the Russian plane and Russian reaction to that. The Turks are pretty outraged, not only over that plane incident, but also over Putin's support for Assad.
Sure. And also the sanctions that Russia's imposed on Turkey as well. That's also creating some bad...
Right now, Turkey is bearing a huge financial and social burden with all the migrants that are flowing out and threats that are flowing out from Syria. And they see Russia basically perpetuating the sectarian conflict in Syria, which is adversely affecting Turkish interests.
Is there a danger that this could escalate in ways that we cannot at the moment envisage? In other words, a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Turkey and Iran, in which Russia's involved, South Caucasus can become involved. I mean, could this spread into some sort of major regional war?
You know, this can certainly spread. The contingency that concerns me the most is inadvertent conflict between Western forces, NATO forces, and Russia. Because if you look over the last year and a half, particularly following the initial invasion of Ukraine, Russian military actions have become increasingly provocative.
Yeah.
And I mentioned the air incursions, the submarine incursions, naval harassment that's going on, these SNAP exercises, uncoordinated military actions. And I've always been concerned that it would be only a matter of time before you had a red-on-blue engagement. A Russian military element colliding, conflicting with a element from an alliance member state. And in fact, we had that with Turkish violations, with Russian violations of Turkish airspace, which led to a NATO ally, shooting down a Russian plane. And with that comes risks of real escalation. And I'm not sure we have properly thought through those risks and how and what we should do to mitigate those risks.
Where could that escalation happen? You're talking about over Middle East, over Ukraine, over the Black Sea, Baltic Sea. I presume there's many possible scenarios.
It could happen wherever Russian forces are acting in provocative manners. I mean, you have airspace violations in the Baltic, you have aggressive actions in the Arctic, you have aggressive actions in the Mediterranean, you have belligerent actions in the Black Sea. And with those actions, particularly at a time when we have less communication between Russian and NATO forces than we had between the Soviet forces and NATO forces during the Cold War, you know, the risk of miscommunication, misunderstanding, overreaction are higher. And today we're dealing with technologies and force postures that are positioned in a way that could unleash escalatory dynamics that could be much more difficult to control. So I would say we are actually now in a very precarious position in NATO's relationship with Russia. And I think it's fair to say that the precariousness of this situation has been driven by Russian bellicosity, Russian provocative, Putin's revanchist ambitions.
Do you think it would be miscalculation that could result in some sort of confrontation between NATO and Russian forces? Or could it be deliberate on the part of Putin, who, remember, is facing some major internal problems that are building up? Economy, regional questions, maybe even a political power struggle. How do you see that?
Well, you know, for me, I sense that Putin is a pragmatist. I don't think he has a vision in which he wants to take over Warsaw or Berlin, but he does want to reassert Russian power. He does have a vision in which he wants to reconstitute Russian influence over the space of the former Soviet Union, and he's willing to use military power towards those ends. He tends to use it cautiously. He probes, and so a lot of these belligerent actions are meant to see and test the West's response, to see how prepared they are for it, to test their will. And I think over the last couple of years, the West strategy, particularly President Obama's strategy of incrementalism in response to these actions, has been counterproductive.
I was going to come to our policy towards Russia in a minute, but yeah, I understand. So you're saying that has encouraged, in a way, Putin's ambitions in the region?
I mean, look at this. Look at the evolution of Russian provocativeness over the last 2 years. When President Putin began his invasion of Ukraine, Crimea, it was a very cautious act. Remember, those special forces just went out and seized the parliament building. No one knew who they were. And he had a couple companies that went out and surrounded 2 airfields, Simferopol and Sevastopol. Didn't stop operations of the airfields, just had the little green men go around and circle.
Yeah.
He was testing the waters. He was probing. And when he saw that there was no response, he then swarmed in 20 to 30,000 special forces and seized the peninsula.
And then actually admitted that he had it planned.
Later on he admitted. But it was a cautious operation. You go down a few months later, and next thing you know, you have a submarine popping up outside the waters of Stockholm. You have more provocative air operations. You go in the spring of, you go to the Wales Summit in September of 2014, and right during the Wales Summit, he does a practice nuclear bombing run on Canada and the United States over the Arctic. And a day or two after the summit, a few days after President Obama had visited Estonia, he does a cross-border snatch of an Estonian law enforcement official. You go into the spring of this year, and he does a 40,000-man snap exercises simulating the seizure of parts of northern Norway, the islands of Finland and Sweden and Denmark. That's increasingly belligerent, provocative action, and it's because he's constantly probing. And he has not been deterred by Obama's and the West strategy of incrementalism. You know, we have incremental sanctions. Our military deployments in response to Russian aggression has been incremental. They're company-level deployments. They're not the battalion or division size. And this incrementalism, I think, communicates communicates hesitancy, a lack of resolve and determination on the part of the West, and perhaps even a lack of unity on the part of the West. And that just has encouraged Putin to kind of push further and further. And when he pushes further and further, I think he's approaching closer and closer a point where there are real risks that he'll go too far and you'll have a real confrontation, and with that will come escalatory dynamics that are going to be very dangerous.
Would you say that our administration, the Obama administration, has underestimated Putin and his ambitions? When you talk about incrementalism, in other words, we tend to respond to some degree to an action that they take, rather than being prepared to prevent them taking that action.
Well, it's hard for me to say what Obama is thinking, but what I can say, his actions reflect the following. One, it reflects a posture that in which countries like Ukraine are not seen as geopolitically significant, that the loss of Crimea is not seen as a real challenge to Western security. It's the incremental sanctions and military actions reflect and can create the perception the United States is hesitant to risk conflict. And that, I think, when seen from the eyes of someone like President Putin, encourages him to kind of push further and further. I think a more robust economic response to Russia's assertiveness and aggression would have helped deter Putin. We certainly could have done a lot more militarily to reinforce NATO's eastern frontiers. We could have done a lot more to reinforce Ukraine's ability to defend itself, to increase the risks and the costs of Russian aggression against that country. Those are actions that capture the respect and attention of President Putin and would make him think twice, I think, about further pursuing, certainly through military means, his ambitions.
Should NATO, in this context, should NATO develop permanent bases or let's say more substantial military and infrastructure in Eastern Europe, particularly in Balkans, Baltics and Poland? I
think the time is long past due. I mean, clearly in today's security environment, in light of Russia's military modernization, in light of President Putin's ambitions, the time is now clearly to have significant military permanent presence in Poland, in Romania, and in the Baltics. We have to think much more assertively about how we can defend those territories. Because today we're in a situation which I think our top European commanders are even raising warnings that the alliance's ability to prevent a sudden mobilization and the contingency that concerns many and concerns me is Russia's ability to rapidly mobilize forces and deploy them with the objectives of seizing limited territorial gains in Central and Eastern Europe. And to do it with the speed and decisiveness that NATO doesn't even have enough time to sit down and decide what has happened and what to do and whether or not it's worth the costs and the risks to reverse. And that's the contingency that keeps me up at night. It certainly keeps up the countries of the Baltics, Poland, possibly Romania up at night, because they're the ones who are living right next door to a much more capable Russian military.
So given that situation, Putin may decide, let's test. Let's grab a piece of maybe part of eastern Estonia or eastern Latvia, Latgale in Latvia, where there's a sizable Russian population, similarly to what happened in Donbass, maybe not even do it directly, but through proxies, and then wait and see what the NATO response. Is that a huge danger?
It's a possibility. I mean, I think it's something we have to prepare for. If you had to ask me if I say that's likely, I'm not convinced that seizing part of Estonia is the top priority of Putin. There are more strategically significant targets he could go after. You know, parts of Moldova, if not all of Moldova, more of Ukraine. Georgia is one that's always a concern to me because that has real geopolitical significance.
Azerbaijan.
Yeah. I mean, those two countries are the cork to the Caspian Sea. And if he can close that off, well, then all of a sudden you solved, you know, problems in Putin's eyes, which may be Western influence in Central Asia and the Caucasus. It resolves the issue of gas flows from the Caspian to Europe. And of course, those are two small countries buttressed up against a very large and capable Russian military force.
I was going to ask you actually about energy flows, because that's been one of the key weapons that Russia has used to try and exert its influence, to expand its influence not only in Eastern Europe but also in Western Europe, tying in various countries into its different pipelines. We had the collapse of this South Stream pipeline, which wasn't really feasible last year, but now there's talk of some new revival of a Turkish stream, some other, let's say, Russian-controlled or Russian-directed pipeline that would go through the Balkans. Presumably now, with countries such as Azerbaijan and some of the Central Asian countries looking towards having independent flows out, you know, not dependent on Russia, this will undercut Russia's one of Russia's main strategic weapons, I would say, the energy weapon. Would you say that this is another danger, that Russia could try and sever those connections between, for example, Caspian Basin and Europe?
It definitely is a danger. And that's why we should be doing more to help countries like Azerbaijan and Georgia. You know, one of the key priorities in the energy front for the West should be the development of the North-South corridor. You know, a gas and oil pipeline that would link the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic and Black Seas. That's important in several respects. One, it would help integrate the Central European markets, which are basically disaggregated energy markets. Two, by going north to south, it would be linking into the east-west arteries and therefore help integrate the region as a whole into the broader European market, making true the vision, or making come to fruition the vision of a truly united European energy market. And by leveraging, you know, the ports of the Adriatic, ports in the Baltic, ports in the Black Sea, you'd be expanding Central Europe's access to increasingly globalized LNG markets, additional sources of crude oil. That would enhance Central European, and I'd argue even European energy security.
And Balkan energy security. Presumably for Albania, for Kosovo, but also for Serbia, and Bulgaria, which have been very much dependent on Russia. This would lessen that dependence.
And it's not an anti-Russian move, because it would still allow Russia to compete in those markets, but it would compete with less of a monopolistic position.
and unbundle some of these aspects of control and distribution that the EU is now taking legal action against.
But this is, one of the this is one of the great challenges in completing the vision of a Europe whole and free. We have the security dimension, we have the regulatory dimension, we have the legal dimension, the political dimension. We should never forget the infrastructural dimension, and that's a still process that's ongoing in Central Europe.
Yeah, because you've covered quite a bit on energy questions. What would you say for people living in Kosovo and Albania in terms of future energy supplies, reliability of energy supplies? Albania, for example, and even Kosovo has regularly had power cuts, electricity power cuts, not a reliable, people can't rely completely on constant energy flows. And then the Azeri pipeline, which is supposed to come on track over the next few years, is supposed to help gasify some of these societies where people don't normally use gas. How would you sort of give us a picture of how things will look over the next few years on the energy front?
Well, the key to energy security is energy diversification. And in case of the Balkans and for much of Central Europe, in addition to energy diversification is energy integration, creating those regional networks that create, alternative sources, competitive sources, backups in case something shuts down due to an inadvertent industrial accident or a political act, or an earthquake or something like that, or aggression. That diversification, those networks, those redundancies would provide for energy security. And ultimately, energy security brings greater prosperity.
So for places like Kosovo, for Albania, they should be supporting diversification, different sources of energy, new sources of energy as much as possible.
They should be leading the charge. Now the problem is that it's hard to get a group of independent nations to allocate the resources and prioritize resources in a way that expedites the development of those cross-border networks, because there's a tendency everyone to kind of want to focus resources on their interests as opposed to a regional interest, and this is a regional challenge.
And this is something, of course, that Russia plays upon, these regional differences, national differences, ethnic differences.
Exactly. Don't worry about them. We'll do things for you. They'll benefit you directly.
Precisely. Let's turn back to NATO a little bit. There was a significant development in December with the NATO invitation to Montenegro, which I think personally is long overdue. What is your view? How will this impact on NATO in the Balkans and the Balkans within NATO?
I applaud that decision. Montenegro has been a stand-up candidate for NATO membership. It's been acting as a de facto member of the alliance, contributing proportionally to different operations. And it's done a lot to meet the criteria for NATO membership. So that's good for Montenegro. It's good for the region because I think it further solidifies that region against influences, particularly in this case from Russia. And it's good for Europe as a whole, particularly because even though it's arguably geopolitically a small step of NATO enlargement, it signifies that the vision of a Europe whole and free is still alive, still relevant, and still moving forward. And that's, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. So it's a good decision, and I hope it'll lead to what I call a wholehearted reanimation of the process of NATO enlargement and a commitment on part of the West to the vision of a Europe whole, free, and secure.
Because as you know, several countries still in the Balkans would like membership, such as Macedonia being blocked by Greece. Kosovo itself, for example, I'm sure most people, majority of people in Kosovo would like to be part of NATO, probably even more than part of the European Union. What would be your message to them? How long will this process take before countries such as Kosovo can join?
It's always hard to say, probably longer than most people want. But the fact that we now have a new member coming in, Montenegro, with that has been a good, I think, reaffirmation among more and more allies that we need to continue the process. The Warsaw Summit will be an important indicator.
That's coming up in June.
In July of...
I say June, July, sorry.
July of 2016 of this year. And I'm hoping that summit will be more than just accepting Montenegro, but it will also be communicating the alliance's commitment to further the process to countries like Ukraine and Georgia.
So, in a way, would you say NATO's coming home? In some respects, Russia's attack on Ukraine made it, let's say, focused our attention on territorial defense, on NATO's core mission to defend its members. Is NATO coming home, would you say, in that
NATO is
respect?
returning back to its fundamental principles. It's not quite there yet, but you can see the ship turning back in that direction. You see it in terms of a refocusing, I'd say an overdue refocusing on the core mission of collective defense. And you see the signs of a reanimated commitment to the vision of a Europe whole and free. That's important. And we have to also remember that in addition to those two pillars, the Wales Summit also has to reaffirm the alliance's commitment to the transatlantic bargain. Because it can't be solely a regionally focused alliance on European security. It has to be an alliance that's also dealing with the global challenges of the 21st century. And by this, I mean it's basically a deal between America and Europe. In return for America's commitment to European security, Europeans have to be willing to stand up with North America in addressing these challenges that are beyond the North Atlantic area. Because without that bargain, you can't assume that the alliance will continue, the vitality of the alliance will continue in a healthy, robust way.
Which raises another question, which I'm asked every so often and which keeps recurring, the idea of some kind of a European army. Is there something within the European Union or something that Europe itself could develop outside of the NATO structure? Would that be credible? Would that be something that we would want to see in Europe?
It's never been credible. The last couple of decades have demonstrated little to no progress in that direction. It's something that has always been more of a theory than a reality. Too often it's been driven by anti-NATO or anti-US motivations. With it comes, if it were to become a reality, institutional duplication. And then I would argue anytime you create new institutions, there's a potential it will instinctively compete with existing institutions. So I see no need for a European army. What I see a need is kind of a more forceful, determined commitment to live up to NATO responsibilities. The responsibilities come with NATO membership.
Which means more defense spending, more efficient use of resources, more better, let's say, exploitation of defense industry, and so on and so forth.
More information sharing, intelligence sharing, living up to force goals, living up to budgetary goals, standing ready to commit to NATO missions, be it in the southern Med, be it south of Turkey, be it in the Arctic.
Mobility questions, I gather, actually moving NATO forces between European states, which is
that's when you start getting into really tactical decisions, which shows how lax the alliance has become to its fundamental mission of collective defense on a regional basis. We'd focus all on expeditionary operations in the last 2 decades, which means basically forces were flying out of a particular country, going to Afghanistan or to Iraq or to the Horn of Africa. Never had we had to really think about and exercise and test our ability to mobilize for essentially territorial defense within Europe, which just raised these mobility issues.
And, I'm always very wary about this term reassurance that the Obama administration has used vis-a-vis Eastern Europe. Why do they need to be reassured every so often that NATO will properly defend them, effectively defend them? We need to move beyond reassurance, I think.
Well, reassurance, I wouldn't abandon reassurance. I mean, reassurance comes through exercises. I mean, let's look at the exercises, because this is interesting. Over the last several years, Russia, say last 3 years, Russia has done a multitude of exercises. A number of these exercises have been very significant. I think over the last 3 years there have been 6 exercises in which Russian forces have deployed over 60,000 personnel. Several of those exercises have been well over 100,000, up to 150 to 160,000 personnel. The largest NATO exercise we've had was Trident Juncture last November, 36,000, and it took 3 years to prepare. Russia does spot exercises, snap exercises, no-notice exercises, with 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 personnel. That's an exercise gap. and NATO has to address that. Because that's, by addressing that, NATO will be reassuring, particularly these frontier states, that's ready to live up to its commitments.
You're talking about demonstrative reassurance. You're not talking about verbal reassurance.
Verbal reassurance is nice. Demonstrative, I think, resonates a little deeper.
Exactly. We don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to spend the last few minutes talking about the US presidential elections, because we're now entering in February officially the presidential election season, election campaign. Although, you know, this is probably one of the longest campaigns anywhere in the world. It's been going for the past year. But just to get your view on the major candidates in both parties, and the Republicans and Democrats, because for people in Kosovo, it's very important to know, to monitor who is going to be the next president, what is going to be their position vis-a-vis the Balkans, particularly vis-a-vis the Albanian world. Maybe just give us a sort of overview, how you see the main Republican candidates, and then we'll turn to the Democrats.
You know, aside from the Trump factor, I think this is actually, from a European perspective, a pretty good set of candidates. While I have my biases as a Republican, I think it's fair to say that whether you have a Democrat or a Republican win, and I put aside Trump, I put aside Bernie Sanders from the Democratic side, you have candidates who I think recognize need for stronger American leadership internationally. There's a pretty consistent recognition that an absence of American leadership, leading from behind, so to speak, has not helped and perhaps even contributed to kind of a worsening international situation, increased volatility, increased assertiveness and challenges from states that are either challenger, if not enemies of the West. I think you're going to have and next administration is going to be less hesitant to use military force. They won't be overly aggressive, but they won't be driven by the current administration's desire to pull America out of conflicts. There's going to be a recognition that force has to be part.
Obama administration.
The Obama administration is a natural and necessary part of an overall strategy. So I think you see a kind of rebalancing. And I think you're going to see a more assertive posture towards Russia, be it a Democratic or Republican administration.
Would that be the case with the Trump administration? I mean, Trump has cozied up. Trump and Putin, let's say, have swapped some very nice words about each other.
I don't think anyone can predict with any certitude what a Trump administration would bring, because he doesn't have a coherent foreign policy that has been expressed. All he talks about is a stronger America, an America that won't be pushed around. But what does that mean? When you get down to specifics, it's a gaping absence. But for the other candidates, I think you're not going to see a willingness to make the same reset mistakes that the last three administrations have made.
In other words, regardless of whether it's Democrat or Republican, you're going to see a new approach towards Russia in particular.
You're going to have a more realistic, a more sober response. You're not going to have sort of the naive optimism that the last three administrations started off with in their approach to the West's relationship with Russia. Well,
the question in Pristina and elsewhere is how serious is the Trump candidacy for president? I mean, will he be the Republican nominee? How do you see that developing?
I don't think he'll be the Republican nominee. I think it's an open question of whether or not then he'll run as an independent. And that will, of course, have a powerful dynamic on the election. But I don't see him becoming elected as President of the United States.
Because there is a fear among some in Muslim populations, his evident Islamophobia, his call for a restriction on immigration, Muslim immigration to the United States. This may impact on actually some of America's most loyal allies in Albania and Kosovo.
It is having an impact. I mean, when someone reaches the status that he has as a presidential candidate, and he makes such outrageous statements about the Muslim community, I have to say I'm disappointed, I'm embarrassed. I think it's outrageous, it's un-American, and I think it's damaging to America's stature in the world.
You don't think it could foreshadow a more isolationist approach by the United States?
No, because I don't think he's going to become president. I don't see a real, among the leading candidates in both parties, I don't see a powerful strain of isolationism. In fact, in the Republican Party, the candidates who have the most isolationist tendencies are the ones who've kind of fallen off. Their competitiveness in this election has declined significantly.
And what will this mean for engagement with Europe? Because one of the criticisms of the Obama administration was that we neglected not only questions around for countries around Russia, but also core Europe, that we didn't engage sufficiently with the Europeans, with European Union, with some of the bigger countries in European Union. How will you see that developing?
Well, I mean, the previous 8 years have featured the decision that the United States is not going to push Europe around. Which I think was a misinterpretation of the Bush administration's efforts and previous administrations to that, to lead Europe. Sure, when America plays a leadership role, not everything it does is going to be 100% appreciated by our European allies. But by and large, American leadership has been supported. American initiatives have been supported by a majority of European nations and European publics.
Right.
It's never 100%, but by and large it's appreciated. Now, my sense is that Europe is missing American leadership today. They would like America to take more role in addressing issues like Russia, like terrorism and such. Right now our leadership role in Europe is largely limited to TTIP. And that's not sufficient.
Finally, tying up to what you were saying earlier, presumably the new administration will be much more focused on NATO, making NATO a more, let's say, effective organization that includes all members that qualify, regardless of attitudes, Moscow's attitudes towards NATO.
Yeah, you know, the next administration, I suspect, will make more of an effort to reanimate NATO's military capabilities. I think you'll be more open to a permanent presence in Central Europe. But with that will also come increased demands on Europeans to live up to their side of responsibilities in NATO. So Europeans, they're going to get more American leadership in the next administration, but with that will come more demands upon them. And it's incumbent upon them to be ready to be a full partner in these responsibilities. Otherwise, they may actually influence and cause the next administration to become disillusioned with the European partnership. So actually now is the time for Europeans to start gearing up to demonstrate to the new team that comes into Washington that they're ready to be a full partner. Because a new team will come in and will do a quick assessment and say, who's doing what? And if they look at Europeans and seeing that they're sitting on the sidelines, unwilling to bear their responsibilities, why will the new administration want to risk political capital in what will be seen as a potential risk or a likely failed enterprise?
Sure.
So now is the time for Europe to prepare for the next administration.
So what should Kosovo do to prepare for the new administration?
Kosovo should, it's a good question. I would say it has to do what it can to demonstrate that it is a local leader for regional cooperation. It has to also think about how it can contribute to alliance and other operations, even though it's not a member of the alliance, but it can certainly act as a partner of the alliance, to demonstrate that it's willing to do its proportional share in the service of transatlantic security and political interests.
Ian, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we'll follow up on this, though, at some point, particularly on the Kosovo equation within NATO and the new administration coming in. So we'll have you back at some point. But I'd like to thank you very much for joining us here at VOA and RTK, and best wishes and success for the coming year.
And vice versa, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at VOA and RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.